Okay, I want to welcome everyone today to our conversation in this series of inspiring heartfelt conversations. And today the theme is men in grief, which sadly is something that's been missed a lot over the years. And today we're hoping to enlighten individuals and open this conversation in a way that we see and respect and honor men and their hearts in a greater way. So I feel so blessed to have Tom Golden as my guest today. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, just give you elements of his bio here so you understand the wisdom that we're going to engage with here in the conversation. Tom is well known for his first book, Swallowed by a Snake, which is the first book that I read. Swallowed by a Snake, The Gift of the Masculine Side of Healing, which opened the conversation about men and emotions. And it was so well received. It got wonderful accolades from noted individuals like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Robert Bly. Tom since has written two other books, The Way Men Heal and Helping Mothers Be Closer to Their Sons. I have read all three books twice now because they're so profound. There's so much wisdom in the Way Men Heal was even more impactful for me. All of them were amazing, but I had a real epiphany when I read the Way Men Heal. So I just want to encourage people to get these pieces of literature later when we finish and learn more on your own. So, but Tom's traveled all over the world as a speaker doing workshops prior to COVID, obviously, in Europe and Australia. In 1999, he was named the International Grief Educator by the Australian Centre for Grief Education. He's got 30 years of practical, hands-on clinical experience as a counselor. And his work and his website, webhealing.com, have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the US News and World Report, as well as CNN, CBS Evening News, ESPN, and the NFL Channel. He served as the vice chair of the Maryland Commission for Men's Health and presently lives outside Washington, D.C., and does online consultations. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Cross-border, Canada, US. We're
There
having
you go.
this. I'm on the west coast of Canada, early in the morning. But I think I came to this conversation initially because as a woman, my husband died just 12 years ago, and he'd lost his first wife and a child to cancer. So I watched his grief journey. And I spent time alone, and then I went again. I'm in my first longer term relationship since he died, and I wanted to understand more about men in general as I got back into a relationship, realizing I think I'm missing something here. I had three sisters and a beautiful father with more of a sort of a feminine nature, a graceful man, but I'm missing something here. So I started doing my own research to try and understand men for the sake of my relationship. And I'm a licensed glider pilot. So at the same time, I was on the airfield with a sea of men, very few women fly gliders. And I felt like an anthropologist in the midst of a different species all of a sudden. And then I was having all these epiphanies, realizing, oh my gosh, I've missed men. Like I've missed them as I started to learn more about the wiring and the testosterone and sort of just the mantle of the male that I kind of knew on a little bit of an instinctive level, but started observing more. And then that took me deeper in, because of my work in hospice, into where are the men in this conversation about grief? As the program director for a hospice society, I had clinical counselors on my staff, and we rarely saw men come to grief groups.
Right.
Or in conversation, right?
Right.
So that led to, articles on it, and then a series with a dear friend of mine, Garrett Caldwell. We did a series on why men grieve differently for Let's Reimagine. So discoveries that were fascinating and important for both men and women. So I just want to set up going into your background and what the turning point was for you by what we learned on the Let's Reimagine platform when Garrick and I did this, a lot more women were coming to the talks.
Right.
And
Right.
only a few men. We thought, why are the women all coming and the men aren't coming? So we started the presentations, which I'd like to start this because we're going to open your eyes to something you might not have seen before. So we invite the women that are coming, and I included myself in this invitation, to let go of your expectations and try and open to see a new perspective on this, because a lot of women coming, whether they want to admit it or not, were coming to learn about how the way men grieve so they could get them to talk about their feelings. Not a good plan. Not a good plan when you learn more. And for the men who are courageous enough to watch this and show up, we want to, in this conversation, by the end, help you to feel respected in your grief, seen in your grief, and maybe even have an insight to the way that you're grieving and have it acknowledged more deeply that may not have been before, right?
Yeah.
So from there, let's go to your entry into this as a counselor in a sea of female counselors.
Yes. Yeah, your description, Barbara, of things being invisible is exactly what I experienced. I mean, I'd just gotten out of grad school. I couldn't find a job anyplace. A Center for Death and Dying offered me a job, and I said, I can do it. I didn't know a thing about death and dying. I'd done a little bit of work before, but not very much. And so I can do it. So I go to this center, the St. Francis Center in DC, and there's boatloads of female therapists and one guy.
Oh,
that's me.
You're brave.
Now the director, no, I was desperate, but it's true. The director was William Wendt, who I love dearly. So there was one other man in the place, but he wasn't a therapist. He was just the kind of the director. So here I am, and guess what happens? The men who got referred to the center all came to me. Why? Because the women didn't want to work with the men. Why didn't they want to work with the men? Because they all said men are not dealing with their feelings. Men won't talk about their feelings. There's something wrong with these men because of blah, 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 blah. So I get this caseload of men and I struggle. Because what I've been taught in grad school is you sit and you talk about it and you make good eye contact and you talk about your feelings, you talk about the past. And when I used that with women, when I first started out, it worked like a charm. It was great. They felt cared for. They felt like they were, yeah. And it was good. But with the men, not so much. And so at first I started thinking, maybe these women therapists are right. Men are not dealing with their feelings. Maybe there's something wrong with them. Maybe they need to be more like women and learn how to feel things. And luckily, that was just a small part of me thinking that, and a larger part of me was just completely flummoxed, just kind of, what the hell's going on here? Until I ran into the cross-cultural research, the anthropological cross-cultural research. And I bumped into it literally. But the more I read, the more I said, holy mackerel, this really makes sense. Because the anthropological research shows something very clearly in grief with Indigenous people. It shows that when there's a big loss, the women in the tribe, in the group, are usually given a place to emote and to talk. They're given a safe place to be able to talk and emote. The men are given something to do, whether it's build the coffin or take care of the rituals or take care of the guests, dig the grave. I mean, all of the things to do were given to the men, including some incredible things. There's one group in Africa, I think it's the Dagura tribe, says that after a death, the men will gather to sing the life of the person who died.
That's beautiful.
Think about that.
That's beautiful.
Sing the life of the person who died. And they split it up so that one person takes early and this person takes from here to here. And, and at the funeral, which just lasts 3 days, these men sing the life. Imagine being in a funeral home, men and women, and getting together to sing the life of the person who died. Can you imagine that as you're singing, Can you imagine not being able to emote? No, the emotion just pours out as you're singing, pours out. So these men were doing something, they were taking an action of some sort that stimulated their emotion, that processed their story of the loss. And that's exactly what happens when people will interact. You know, when people interact, women particularly will interact, they tell the story. And as they're telling the story, the emotion comes up and it flows through them. So slowly I started realizing, holy crap, there's more than one way to do this. You know, there's more than one way. It's not, because at the time, this was in the late 70s and 80s, the general default was, if you're going to grieve, that means you cry and you talk about it.
Mhm.
And that was a very strict rule. Those who didn't cry, maybe there's something wrong with them.
Mhm.
You know? So I started realizing at St. Francis that maybe it wasn't just crying. Maybe there were other things that go on here too, you know, including activity of sorts. And so I started looking for activities that men were doing. And I started seeing things that I'd never seen before. You know, I
Mhm.
started seeing that men will indeed do some action that helps them connect in with their story, which then brings up the emotion to them personally. They process and they move through. You know, so it's
Yeah.
a very different kind of ritual for men. And in fact, men's grief at that time was invisible to me because I couldn't see it, because I had yet to connect action or inaction. You know, that's
Mhm.
the other piece. Men tend to use action and inaction. Women tend to use interaction. Before we go a step farther,
Yeah, and can
yeah, let's stop right there
yeah.
because
Well, and yeah. So let me just say a personal thing
you
on
can
that,
say
and
it.
let's get to the what, because we'll go into that a bit later.
Okay.
But let me just acknowledge that here I am on the airfield with all these men as a woman, and I'm in hospice. I'm a fresh widow when I start flying, and there's just been a death. There's been a tragic death of a glider pilot, and I show up 2 weeks later. So
Right.
I'm still a year out in my grief, you know, processing in a certain way. And then in their vulnerability, they've welcomed me in. They're sensitive to me because I'm a widow, and they know the widow of the fellow who's just died, and they're vulnerable. And then I'm life has set me up to be a woman in the sea of men, and I start to observe this different protocol,
Yes.
the
Yes.
shoulder to shoulder, which we're going to talk about,
Right. Right.
the not so much sharing in the big group in the hierarchy of men,
Right.
if you will, other than maybe
Yes.
through story, but one-on-one, shoulder to shoulder, polishing a glider, and just gently introduce, this must have been an amazing man. I'm sorry I didn't get to meet him. And then the
Yes.
beauty of a story that comes up,
They will tell you the story.
and the way they would, you know, can I bring a truck to help the widow? Can I do the, you know, you
Right.
just see
Right.
acts of service. So
And there's
that's touching in on it, right?
there's something very important that you just said, and that is that the story comes out as you're doing an action.
Mm,
As you're polishing the glider,
mhm,
then you're shoulder to shoulder, both doing the same task,
mm,
and things start happening. You know,
yeah,
things start moving through. What I wanted to say before, Barbara, was that, you know, we can't lump all men into one pile and
yeah,
all women into the other. I mean, we got to stop right there and say, hang on, guys, because there's a lot of gray out there, a huge amount of gray. And there's reasons for the gray and for the extremes. And we can talk about the physical reasons later. But anyway, my
well,
eyes were, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's the next thing I want to go into to set it up before we go in. So there's the testosterone flood
Yes,
that has an
yes,
effect on the wiring of the brain, you know, as well as an estrogen flood for the women. So we have so let's talk about that as a foundation before we get into the
yes,
male, female, and the
yes.
masculine, feminine expression within each male and female. So
Yes.
can you talk to both the
Well, let's talk about
physical wiring and then the masculine, feminine elements of each of us?
and both are connected. You know, I mean, grief has a biological piece, it's got a social piece, it's got a genetic piece, it's got a hormonal piece. There's all kinds of things going on, but it's not one dimensional. You know, a lot of times people will forget the biological piece these days, and we need to remember that because at 2 months in utero, 2 months, the baby is like this big, about as big as a walnut. You know, at that time, there's this testosterone flood that comes into the baby boy's brain. And this flood, we know, does certain things. It changes the brain. It changes the brain. And it impacts things like sexual orientation. It impacts things like gender identity, who you think you are, whether you think you're male or female. It impacts aggressive levels, and it impacts the way we play. And also, some researchers are thinking that it impacts the brain's total functioning, so that the more masculine brain, the people who get this flood in a big way, are going to have what they call a systems-oriented brain, a brain that's more oriented to systems. Those who don't get the flood have a more empathic brain, or a brain more connected to relationship. And it's fascinating. Now, the important thing here is that some women get the flood. Some women get this flood of testosterone. So this is why you can't put all men in one pile and women in the other. I mean, even biologically, we have this gray area there that's unknown. And you know, the women who get this flood, we call them tomboys. You know, those are young girls who we recognize they're playing more like the boys. They want to climb trees. They want to go out and play coalitional sports. You know, all kinds of things. But this is in utero. This is in utero. The other thing that the testosterone flood does is it primes the brain, primes the little walnut-sized fetus, primes the brain there for later testosterone. So the receptors in the brain get primed for testosterone. So later, as this boy becomes a man, his brain is going to be much more sensitive to testosterone when it's pumped through his veins. So it's all kinds of physical things. And when we'll talk, I hope, about testosterone and how that the activational testosterone, or what happens when we get a burst of testosterone as adults, what that does to the brain and what it does to grief also, because that's important.
Well, and I think that was powerful for me to read, because even as the testosterone goes up, there's that other hormone, prolactin,
Right.
which connects you to your emotional tiers. And as the testosterone goes up in young men, the prolactin, if I'm right, from
there's
what
an
I've read.
inverse relationship. That's right.
Yeah. And so it's different for men to connect to their tiers. You know, even we talk about the transgender experiences that are happening.
Yes.
People taking different hormones and that.
Yes.
But I'm also older, and there's an interesting shift after menopause for the women, but we forget the men, their testosterone drops. And I have all these male friends that are post-male menopause, and they're going, I'm crying all the time. Like
That's it.
And they're like, I never cried this much before. Well, their testosterone just dropped. So, you know, there's this beautiful opening of the discussion about our sexuality, transgender, gender neutral, all this beautiful open dialogue we never had before, but also just organically as we shift in, you know, as the flood comes in adolescence, but then later when it changes in menopause for both men and women, like these guys I know, like I'll tell them something and they're weeping, and I'm like, aren't you adorable? You know, this never happened to me before. What's going on?
3 testosterone floods. One is in utero that we're talking about. The next is at puberty. They call it the mini puberty. Is not puberty. I'm just talking about back up. First is the testosterone flood. Then at birth, there's this burst of testosterone again that's called the mini puberty, because it happens at birth. Any parent who's had a little boy remembers that in that first month, they'll try and diaper the boy, and that little penis, boing, will stand straight up. That's because he's flooded with testosterone. And then the third flood is at puberty, you know, when we get this testosterone that's pumping into us. And it's the third one that really impacts our grief and the way we are, because when boys are 5, 6, and 7 years old, we can cry. I could cry like crazy when I was a little guy. You know, I was in Washington, D.C. I followed the Redskins and the Senators, and at that time they lost almost every game. So I
Oh,
knew tears.
well, yeah.
But then when I got to be 13, the tears dried up.
Mm.
And we know now that it's testosterone that dries up those tears, because testosterone limits the emotional tears in men. After they're 13 or so, it limits. Then testosterone goes up until 27, 28, and levels off. Then I think mid 30s, it starts coming down, so that by the time you're 60 and 70, you're not as pushed by testosterone as you were before,
Mm.
and your tears start to come back again.
Mhm.
So ladies, the men in your life, if they're not crying, there's a reason for it. It's
Mhm.
probably hormonal. Don't judge him. I've heard so many times people say, he's not crying. He couldn't be grieving. He's just thinking about himself. All kinds of judgments come out because of no tears. But the guy's tears dry up. And the reason we know, or one of the reasons we know, is because of the trans men.
Mhm.
Should we talk about the trans men a little bit? Because it's fascinating.
Sure, if you want to do that, and then we'll move into the sort of the roles of men, which I think is fascinating too, the mantles of men.
Well, we got to talk about the trans men are fascinating because it's biological women who take huge doses of testosterone. And what happens when they take these huge doses of testosterone is A, their tears dry up. B, they start not being able to articulate their emotions when they're in the throes of feeling them.
Mm.
And C, instead of wanting to talk about things, this book, The Testosterone Files by Max Valerio, who's a trans man. I interviewed Max and another trans man. It was a fascinating interview talking about their transition and what happened to them emotionally as they transited. Absolutely fascinating. But one of the things Max said was when he started taking huge doses of testosterone, he stopped wanting to talk about things.
Mm.
Before he'd go to a girlfriend and just talk. Now, no, he doesn't want to do that. He either wants to pull back and get quiet, or he wants to hit something.
Mm.
Take action of some sort.
Well,
So,
and interesting too. I know two men who, or women, two pilots. One is older and one is younger, who were men and trans. Went became
wow.
female, and I know them personally. So I have sat with both of them at length and had deep discussion
Yes.
about the
Yes.
calling to make that transition. And then when they started taking the other hormone, their experience. So that's been a
And what did they
fascinating.
say? What did they say?
Well, the opposite, feeling more deeply, wanting to share, wanting to connect. Yeah, so that was
More
fascinating.
relaxed,
Yeah.
right? I worked with people who were sick, at St. Francis, and the women sometimes had to take testosterone as a part of their regimen, for getting better. And they used to come to me and they'd say the same thing. Tom, I got to get off of this stuff. I got to get off this stuff, the testosterone. I said, why? And they'd say, because it makes me anxious as hell and I can't stop thinking about sex. I'm thinking, welcome to my world. It's like this stuff has impacts on us, and it impacts the way we grieve.
Well, and let's move into that as well. Like a male friend of mine told me about Alison Armstrong years ago, because she does a lot of workshops for women understanding men and also men to understand women. But she talked about the wiring of the brain and the warrior, hunter, protector. So I say this to women: if you are wired to be a warrior, a hunter, a protector, a provider, and you're out on the battlefield or out in the bush going to get that deer, if
Right.
you break down and start crying in the middle of the battlefield, Alison Armstrong says this beautifully, what's going to happen to everybody else?
Right.
You could
Right.
die because everyone's now got to turn to, or you're about to shoot the deer and the girl goes, hey, Sally, there's a deer. Well, if you're out, there's a deer, like gone, so that was a real epiphany for me. I'm reading a book, actually, The Female Brain, which is the opposite, with the
Right,
estrogen flood
right, right.
and the need to, as you say, we'll talk about tend and befriend. But if you put it, then let's bring it back to grief. If a man is wired for these roles organically and give us the gift of protector, provider, hunter, warrior to bring the food, there's a wiring for a little bit of a different, I don't want to say men aren't emotional, because they are deeply emotional.
Yes,
It's
yes,
just, and that's the thing that when people don't always and my partner and I have it, he goes, men are really emotional. It's
yes.
just, it's different.
You don't see it. It's invisible.
Right. So,
And that's what happened to me at St. Francis when I started off, was I couldn't see it. And that's what you were talking about when we first started. You simply can't see it. And there's so many good reasons for not being able to see it.
well, and I've heard people, women come in after a loss and going, and he's out cutting a tree in the back and he's not grieving. Well, he's cut every tree down in the back because he's working it out, right?
Yes, yes.
So, and again, we've talked about, as an individual, there's the feminine and masculine expression in each of us. So in same-sex couples, you'll see different expressions of the masculine and feminine and the dynamic of the relationship. So that can have an influence on how the person grieves too.
Oh.
But let's move into, because ritual, as you say, cross-cultural ritual really shows a respect that the tribal cultures used to have for that wiring, as you say, singing the song or giving space. So let's get into action with men and activity and ritual.
Yes. And I think before we get there, let's talk about the Shelley Taylor stuff just a little bit. Because here I was at St. Francis kind of confused about what's going on, starting to see that action was important. But then along comes Shelley Taylor in the early 2000s. And Shelley Taylor did this research on stress and women. She found out that almost all the research prior to the year 2000 was done on men and stress. And so she said, I'm going to study only women. And it was so important what she did. What she found out was women, when they're stressed, don't fight or flight. Women tend and befriend. Women will move towards others when they're stressed. Very different from the fight or flight piece, which is probably more pulling back, more moving into action of some sort. And it's so critical that we understand this, that now we know from research that women are going to be more likely to move towards others and interact. Men will be more likely to pull back, either inactive or to do something in response to that loss, whatever it was, whatever the stress was. And Taylor found the oxytocin piece there too. She found that when we're stressed, we get a big burst of oxytocin, both men and women. And she thought, well, wait a minute, why on earth would it be that the oxytocin would impact women one way and men the other? And what she found out was that the estrogen brain amplifies the oxytocin. So they really want to tend to befriend. They really want to connect with other people. Whereas the testosterone negates the oxytocin. It pushes it down. We're also finding now that oxytocin, that hormones in general, react differently in the male and female brain. They know now that fathers and mothers, when they get a burst of oxytocin and they have little children, it does something very different. For the mothers, it makes her want to go, oh, baby, coo, 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 talk what they call mother ease, and to hold and to kind of be there, But the fathers, what does it do? The same hormone for the fathers doesn't make them want to go coo, 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 although some dads may do that. Generally, what it does to the fathers is it makes them want to play, makes them want to connect with the kids in a playful way and to be there in a rough kind of way too. We know rough housing is so critical for fathers. How many dads, throwing the kids up in the air, just throwing them up in the air, and the mothers go, oh, don't drop them, don't drop them. And the dads, oh, we're fine. Now we know that this act of throwing children in the air, which dads do automatically, helps children with risk-taking later in life. And there's all kinds of things we know now that dads are doing that impact the way the children are. But anyway, don't let me get off on that. We got to get back to
Okay, we got to
the
get
grief
back
and
to,
things.
well, and I see that in the
But there's
men.
just so much out there that's, and
I
there's
know.
the research has been out there, but the media will not cover it. I do not know why. But all these fantastic things about men and boys are just out there for your grabbing. You know, if
Well,
you
and
read my book, you'll find out too.
even that, like my brother-in-law and nephew, and he's like 17 now, 18, and over the years I visit my sister back east, and those two rough house, like right in front of us, they're like floating like all over the place, but then you'll watch as they put boundaries down for each other.
Exactly. And the
And then,
roughhousing, that's what dads do. They say, no,
yeah,
no, you can't pull the ear. No, you
right.
can't poke anybody in the eye. So the kids learn the difference between aggression and violence and fun.
Hmm.
And that's a critical thing for kids to learn. And they
Right.
learn it from dads who roughhouse.
Okay, back to our,
We could stay on dads for a while.
Yeah, this is rich. And my dad
Oh,
just died recently, and my
yep.
dad was a magnificent human being, like
Yes.
just a gracious, phenomenal man who I
Yeah.
was blessed to call, and had such a respect for women and the feminine. So
Yeah.
because of him, I have a great respect for men, because of his respect for the daughters, 4 daughters, and how he fostered both elements of who we are with the highest regard. And so it's my goal too, to hold that same respect for men that
Yes.
he
Yes.
endeared to me, right? So,
Yes.
okay, so let's get into action, because we do often miss this with men. And
There's,
you so beautifully show different, from creativity to play to thinking to C.S. Lewis, wonderful examples in your book. So what do you mean by action? Give us examples of what that looks like.
well, if we could back up just a second, because even before we get to action, there's 4 reasons why men's grief is invisible. And it's important that people know these reasons. One is a man's pain is taboo in our culture. No one wants to touch a man's pain. And if you think about going into your favorite restaurant, you're walking in, you're being seated, and you look over to the left, there's a woman crying at the table. What's your first thought about that?
I wonder what happened to her. Is
What
she
happened to her?
okay?
Poor dear, she needs support, right? I've given thousands or talked to thousands of therapists about this, and they all say the same thing. Poor dear, she needs support. She's upset. She probably got jilted, whatever. Now, erase that image, go in and walk in the same restaurant, except this time it's a man crying there at that table. What's your first response?
It's hard that I want to admit this, but is he okay? Like, what's going on with him? And you're worrying that there might be a deeper issue happening.
Might be
with
something
him.
wrong.
Yeah.
Because the therapists I talk to, all of them say the same thing. There's something wrong with that guy. Steer clear of him. He's probably drunk.
Okay, I wouldn't have
Can
thought
you
that.
see the default? Yeah, you're not there. I mean, you have a different balance of masculine and feminine for most people. But can you see how the default is to see the woman's pain as a call to action and the man's pain as taboo? That's the first. The second one is the dominance hierarchy. Men live in a hierarchy. We live in a hierarchy that most people don't understand or are not aware of. But men's hierarchy is based on a lot of things, and independence is the critical piece. Men will always try, not always, but men will usually try to appear independent, and they will be reinforced for that. The most independent men get reinforced and chosen as sex partners, right? The men who are high in status, the men who are independent, the men who have lots of money or fame or whatever, those are the men who get all the girls, right? Those are the men who are higher in status. This is the whole thing about the hierarchy for men. And here's the deal. Crying in public, what does it do to your status in the hierarchy? It drops you like a rock. Women look at a crying man and think, I don't think so. He's needy, right? That's number 3. What's number 4? Let's see. The physical reasons we're talking about is one more. Oh, the provide and protect that you were talking about before too is another reason. Men are locked into this role of provide and protect and still are locked into it. Whereas women's roles, we've kind of eased up a little bit. Imagine at night, you're waking up and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and something boom, 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 boom in the basement, right? So you and your husband say, who's going to go? And she says, honey, will you go? And he says, oh yeah, I'll go. So he can go down and he'll be the hero, right? He'll be reinforced for that. Or she could say, honey, I'll go. And she'd be a real hero. Wow, she's brave. Or she could say, I don't really want to go. Will you go? And that'd be okay too. So she has this role flexibility where she could do either one. But imagine what would happen if the guy said, no, I don't want to. Can you go?
Mm.
That's provide and protect. That's the role right there that locks men into not showing their emotion. You know, imagine a policeman going to, or a fireman going to a fire and dropping the hose and crying, oh, this fire is terrible. Oh. No, he's got to do his job first. Then later he can emote.
Mm.
Anyway, that's a quick, brief overview of the four. And now let's talk a little bit about the actions and what they are.
Actions and ritual too, because
Yeah, well, the rituals are basically the framework that the action takes place in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, any ritual is based on what? It's based on safety first. In
Mm-hmm.
any grief that we can heal from, the first thing we have to have is safety. We have to feel safe. And women and men feel safe in very different places.
Mm-hmm.
You know, women will feel safe interacting. Men will feel safe shoulder to shoulder on the same team. That's where men get close to each other, when we're doing things together, especially if it's a dangerous team, you know, like the police, the fire department, and war. I mean, these are places men get very close to other men, intimate with other men, because they're shoulder to shoulder on the same team, working towards the same goal.
Flying planes with no engines.
Your glider pilots, exactly. That they're on the same team, and they will get close to each other because of that. You know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So men will feel safe in that, or they'll pull back and become inactive. They'll pull back into solitude. Solitude's gotten so much shame, Barbara. You know that we look at men sometimes and go, oh, he's not dealing with his feelings. You know, there's something wrong with him. He's not talking about it. He's not doing anything, but he's pulling back and getting quiet. I mean, think about the Bible. Think about Christ. When he was really up the creek, he would go into the desert 40 days and 40 nights. And I don't remember Mary telling him he needed to join a support group. You know, he knew he needed to become alone for a while. Men know this. Men will do this. Men will grieve in a car driving, or a truck. Truckers will grieve. They'll tell that story over and over in their brains. This is the inactive mode of grief that's invisible. You can't see it, but men use it all the time. So do women. In fact, interesting thing about the indigenous peoples is they'll always give men something to do, but they give women places to emote and things to do.
Mm.
So you'll find even in our culture, you know, that women will use both active and inactive and interactive modes. Men will tend to use the inactive and the active. So we're all exceedingly different, wonderfully different, you know.
Right. So let's get into a little bit more of sort of concrete images of what action really means. I mean, I think when I was first reading your book, it really came, you know, the men used to dig the graves. The men used to build the coffins.
Right.
And we did, if you look, we're doing this just before Christmas and it'll come out in the new year, but that beautiful show that comes out every year at Christmas time, the black and white movie, It's a Wonderful Life.
Right.
After the death of his father, Jimmy Stewart is wearing a black armband in that film. Yes. And we know of the women's dress, the black dress, but you know, a lot of people don't know that men used to wear black armbands after a significant death, who's still in that film. That's gone now too. Men are known for going to, from the research I've read in your books, going and visiting the gravesite.
Yes.
More often than the women do, actually, because it's so an action, a place, or a thing comes up in that category.
Yes.
You know, so can you explain, give examples of actions and activities that men might do in the categories of creativity, thinking, you know, practicality, that we can sort of anchor on so we understand a bit better what you mean by that?
outlined it for me, practicality, creative, and thinking. Because as I was at St. Francis, I was trying to see what actions are these guys taking. So I'd start asking different questions. Instead of what are you feeling, I'd say, what are you doing?
Mm.
What are you doing that's important to you?
And
And
stop for a minute.
boy,
That's a really important note for counselors too. Instead of what
yeah,
are you feeling, what are you doing, right?
yes, yes.
As well as individuals interacting with a man. But
And
okay.
men will respond to that question much easier. In fact, I found when I worked with and still work with men when they come in, the first thing to talk about is whatever there's on their mind.
Mm.
And then usually there's an easy way to segue into the feeling stuff. Like this guy that loves football, so we talk about the Redskins. He comes in, we talk about the Redskins for a couple of minutes, oh, so-and-so did such and such. Then it's easy to say, well, did your wife like the Redskins? His wife had died, 6 months before. Oh, she loved him. We'd do this and that together. And then you move from what his interest is, his activity, into the feeling mode by sort of easing into it through a question that just sort of slides you there. In other words, working with men is a lot of what's the word for it? Sideways. You don't do direct. What are you feeling today, sir? You do it in an indirect manner that makes them feel safe, because the safety piece is so critical. Where do men feel safe? Remember, it's shoulder to shoulder. It's doing something. This little boy that I get women coming to me all the time, not all the time, but frequently. They'll come to me and they'll say, will you please see my son in therapy? He's
Mm.
not grieving. His father died 6 months ago and he hasn't cried yet. I'm thinking, okay. So I say, tell you what, let's try something. She told me that her son loves to play basketball and played a lot of basketball with his father. So I said, this week, go back and play basketball with him. Come back next week and tell me what happened.
Mm.
And so she comes back next week and she says, I don't need you anymore.
Mm.
And I said, good. I said, why? Why don't you need me? Because, and then she told me the story of what happened when she started playing basketball with her son.
Mm.
Played basketball with him. And first thing he did was, Mom, you suck. You can't play at all. You really suck. Dad could do this, that, and the other, right? That's what comes out first. But then in the middle of the game, he made this shot. He said, I made one. And she said, what? I made one. Dad used to call those a three-pointer.
Mm.
And last week, I could never do it while he was alive, but last week I made it for the first time and I started to cry. And she
Mm.
realized then, holy crap. And he was crying then as he was describing this whole scenario to her. And she realized, he's grieving. I just wasn't approaching him in the right way. I needed to find a way to make him feel safe. And the
Mhm.
basketball made him feel safe. He was shooting baskets. He was telling his mother she sucked. That's what made him feel safe. That's where he's happy, right? So, ladies, think about where your sons or gentlemen, your male friends, feel safe. Do that. And as you're doing that, move indirectly into things, and you're probably going to hit pay dirt.
Going on a hike in the woods. You go on a
Yes,
hike
yes,
together, and in
yes.
the middle of the hike, my partner sometimes has said to me, when we go hiking, you stop talking and I'm doing all the talking.
There you go.
And I just thought, well, we're in an activity, we're in a beautiful setting. It's a physical act. Like
And
he's connecting with his body through the physical act. And there's
remember, men don't think their emotions are something anyone wants to hear. The hierarchy has told them that no one wants to hear this stuff. I was amazed when I first started working with men. One time I said, well, can you tell me more about what that's like? And he looked at me and said, do you really want to hear that shit?
Mm.
I said, yeah, man. Yeah, bring it out. And he said, okay. And so then we started talking about it. But that taught me a lesson. Men, by default, sometimes are thinking that no one really wants to hear this because they've been shunned so often. People don't want to hear their emotions. People run away.
But
God,
that's an important point though, Tom, too, because the other thing you reflect on in the book, and we've like at funerals or events, who do they go? How are you doing to the mother or the wife or the
right.
children? And they don't. And I recently had an experience with that. A friend of mine has had cancer and she's been going through treatment. She's in remission, but she was in a trial study, and I met her and her husband, and it's been difficult. And she and my partner went in to get a coffee, and I sat with him and I turned to him and I said, "What's happening for you? Like,
Right.
how are
Right.
you doing?" And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, you're like the second person who's asked me that. Thank you so much for asking
Yes.
me.
Yes.
Thank you. I feel so moved that you've even asked me." And I said, "Well, it's not easy to be a caregiver." And so he just started opening up. But that was as I, it's missed. And then even when people do approach men, sometimes they'll go fine because it's face to face and it's a bit, so there's a
Right.
gentle way to approach a man,
Yes.
I think,
Yes.
because to go and say, "How are you doing?" can be that way. So then women get confused. Well, how do I approach him to find out?
And the
But
guy's experience is the people come up to his wife and to his kids and say, "Oh, how are you? What are you feeling?" And they'll come up to him and say, "How's your wife holding up?" I mean, men have experienced that over and over again. And
right.
so,
So
that's men assume that people don't want to hear this. They assume
so
it.
so the thing here is, don't forget the men. Don't forget to include them in, gently invite an opportunity to share when there's a safe, kind of less threatening setup to do that. And
And do it indirectly.
mhm,
For instance, a guy's father dies. The guy's father and he loved the local baseball team. So the wife says, "Honey, I'd like to take you to a baseball game in honor of your father."
mhm,
Because all of these actions that we're going to talk about here are all connected to honoring.
mhm.
Let's talk about Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan had an experience where his father was murdered.
Oh,
It was a really terrible, awful experience. And 2 months after that, he had a press conference. He said, "I'm quitting basketball." And everyone's like, why? And then 2 months after that, Jordan said, "I'm going to start playing um, professional baseball." And he did. He tried. Of course, he wasn't very good and he flopped and he came back to baseball later or basketball later. But what was going on there? People still are scratching their head saying, why did he do that? But guess what? You know the reason why he did that?
mhm,
We know now why. The reason was that Jordan's father always wanted him to be a baseball player.
mhm,
He had told Jordan even a week or so beforehand, "You're going to be the best baseball player ever. You got to play baseball instead," right? So Jordan honored his father
mhm,
by moving to baseball. Isn't that amazing?
mhm,
Just absolutely amazing. That is what men do. They will do
mhm,
an action that honors someone. In Jordan's particular case, it was his work that he changed, which is kind of a practical way of changing. You change something in a practical way, or you do something in a practical way. And it's this practical action, like Jordan took, that honors the loss in one way or another. And when men honor the loss, the emotions start to pour through. Now there's creative ways to do this
mhm,
too. You think about Eric Clapton when his son died. What did
mhm,
he do? He pulled back and he only did two things. He only went to AA meetings or he played his guitar,
mhm,
you know, and he describes in his autobiography how when he played his guitar, he suddenly had songs coming up.
mhm,
Songs started to pop up. He started writing these songs all about grief. One song was My Father's Eyes, which is a
mhm.
song about thanking his son for allowing him to see his father's eyes, because Clapton had never seen his father before, but he could see his father's eyes through his son's eyes.
That's
And
beautiful.
then the Tears in Heaven was another one. But the last one was When the Circus Left Town, which was the most potent as far as grief goes. And that was the song about um, the night before his son died, Clapton had taken him to the circus. And the song is about telling the son, this will have to be your only time to go to the circus in your life. Oh,
Oh,
look at that song on YouTube. And if you don't cry during that song, you're a
mhm,
rock, you know?
mhm,
But think of Clapton as he's writing the song. Is his story coming up about his son? Are
mhm,
things pouring through his brain? Are the emotions pouring through? Absolutely. But he's not talking about it. He's not
mhm,
saying anything. He's just playing his guitar. In fact, the quote from Clapton was something like, "My guitar is my salvation." Some
mhm.
people wondered about what I was doing, but it was my guitar that was my salvation. And that's what took him into this action that helped him honor his son, that then brought the emotions out, and the healing follows, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
Well,
that's,
and in the zone of creativity, it could be sculpting, it
oh,
could be building a pond, it could be
yes,
writing, so many of the creative arts.
painting, singing,
Mm,
all kinds of things it could be.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Blogging, I mean, who
mm-hmm,
knows?
mm-hmm,
Actually, blogging is more of the next one we'll talk about, which is thinking, which
mm,
is the one that confuses people the most, because thinking is kind of the opposite of feeling, and it throws people off. But a lot of times men will use their thinking mode, their philosophical mode, to be able to heal, to be able to
mm-hmm,
find a safe place to bring up that story, you know?
mm,
And one of the typical therapist tricks is, after someone comes in from a loss, ask them to write a letter to the person who
mm,
died.
mm-hmm.
That's a very thinking oriented activity that helps bring up all the memories, all the stuff, but we're doing it through thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Blogging is another way.
Well,
Um,
in C.S. Lewis, you use the example,
oh,
a
yeah.
beautiful book, A Grief Observed, which I
It's
read many years ago.
all about his grief for his wife,
Mm-hmm.
writing books. This one father that I worked with, his son died, and he wrote this little book about his son. And and in writing the book, he went around and interviewed the son's teachers, the girlfriends, ex-girlfriends, all the people in the son's life, and put this little book together, not to publish at Random House, but just to give out to his family. But the action that he took, the action of interviewing these people, what's he doing? He's telling the story. The story's
Mm-hmm.
coming up over and over again. This is his safe place. It
Mm-hmm.
was safe for him to do a book
Mm-hmm.
and to bring up all that emotion during that time that he was writing this stuff. Can you see how the writing itself was a safe place for him to move through the grief? But
Well,
it's
and
invisible. People don't see that as really grieving. It's
and
invisible.
you helped me to see my father by going into the and now because it's such a close loss. Beautiful sorry, 6 months ago. So he was 98 when he died, but he was British, and in the Second World War in the British Navy, and his ship sunk. It was a historic event. The Scharnhorst. The Scharnhorst was a German, pretty nasty destroyer. My father was a deeply sensitive man and was impacted by the fact that the actions he was involved in had cost others' lives, right? So
Yes.
four daughters, we didn't know that happened on, I think, December 26th, the day after Christmas. So we didn't know that every year, hidden, he would go into another room, take a picture of the Scharnhorst, and so there's a thing he's anchored on, a photograph, and he would spend quiet time every year. We didn't know this till he was older, and just sit with the picture and honor the men whose lives were lost.
Wow.
Now, later, when he retired, he heard that another British ship came around, picked up the survivors on the German ship, and every year they had a reunion. So to heal, we're watching him. To heal, he goes to the reunion of the survivors of the ship.
Yes.
Sits across the table with these young guys, and they're talking about the Hitler Youth, and they had no idea what was happening, and their, confusion at that age. And he's taught, and then together it was healing, because now their humanity is face to face.
Yes.
On a table, and there's a healing in that. And what does he do with that? He decides to write novels and self-publish them. So the first novel is a love story about a British young man falling in love with a young German female, and they fall in love before the war. And then he weaves the story of the Navy and the sinking of the ship and them being separated. And he wrote 3 books and went to a place where the Scharnhorst was. But then we watched it shift. My father's heart was open until he died. He was magnificent. But I did not see the whole journey of that until I read your book and thought, oh my God. And we all thought, saw the magnificence of the healing, but in these subtle ways of aloneness and anchoring and connection to other men, in the camaraderie, and then the
And
writing, right?
honoring is the key to all of it. And
Oh,
your dad hit almost all the points in one episode, you know. I mean, through practicality,
mhm,
thinking, creativity, and a pilgrimage.
mhm,
Pilgrimage is also a typical masculine path that the pilgrimage is made. One guy I worked with, his daughter died in a car accident out on the West Coast, and he lived on the East Coast, and he made a pilgrimage to that accident site.
mm,
That was important for him, you know, to go out there and to be there and to feel it. And just that pilgrimage is healing in itself, you know.
yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So, so let's. Yeah, I've had waves of just wanting to cry in this because there's been magnificent
Well,
men in my life, but the pilots have just been in the camaraderie of men to be given the
yes,
gift of being accepted. They're kind of like
yes,
my band of brothers. It's
yes,
been quite profound to learn about the quiet sort of protocol amongst the men, and yet just they're magnificent. After
yes.
my husband's death, they helped me to keep my heart open to adventure, just
Mm,
by their enthusiasm for life. And so I just, this is part of the reason I want to do this, is so that we don't miss the beauty of this,
yes.
even though it's
It
being
is beautiful.
expressed differently.
Exactly. Well said. It's expressed
Hmm.
differently, but it is beautiful. When you really
Hmm.
get a sense of the way men do things, it's like
Hmm.
awesome. You
Hmm.
really, and the men I work with, a lot of times they come in and they're saying, I don't know what I'm doing. And by the first session, they've told me all these actions they've done that have honored the loss, and they start to connect the dots. They start to see, oh crap, I am grieving. you
Yeah.
know, and a lot of men it's like this. I mean, they've never been told that what they're doing is actually a healing a modality, you know.
Well,
So it's
after Garrick's wife died, when we did this Let's Reimagine thing, his wife had a garden. And at first he couldn't go into the garden.
right.
But then about a year later, he went into the garden. He started working in the garden. And he felt
Yep.
close to her through the garden. And we
Yes.
had one
Yes.
young man in the group where we were presenting. And the young man at the end said, "Oh, thank you for that, because I've been going into my parents' garden. My sister's crying. And I kept thinking, there's something wrong with me. I'm not grieving." And and then Garrick gave this beautiful example of the
yes.
garden and the memory of his wife. And the young man said, "Oh my gosh, I am grieving. I'm
Yeah.
just doing it differently than her. Because every
Yes.
time I go in the
Exactly.
garden, I'm honoring my wife or my parents." And
Yes.
there's a nurturing and a metaphor of new life in that too, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah, that's beautiful. Male role models. I think, we don't talk about the importance of that. I mentioned to you as we were preparing for this, when Garrick and I were preparing for the other one, this movie, I think it was Netflix or Prime, The Best of Men. And it was a documentary on, I can't remember his name, Ludwig Guttmann, who was the founder of the Paralympics. And he was a Jewish German neurologist who came to Oxford, and then eventually was invited to work with young men coming back from the war who were paralyzed, basically being left sedated, immobilized in bed to die. And this guy was horrified by this and brilliant, and went in and understood all the layers of grief with the men. They'd lost comrades in war, they'd lost body parts, they had no sense of
Right.
a future. And just to watch how this man brought in sport for rehabilitation, connecting them to their bodies, giving purpose, and then the birth of the Paralympics. But that's a stunning true life story of an amazing male role model that challenged these guys.
Yes.
Wasn't light on them. Oh my gosh, you should have seen the way he challenged them sometimes. Even the nurses were going, "Don't do that." And he's going, "No, he's got to do that." That a woman probably couldn't do. But at the same time, he was holding such respect for them and their value, despite the fact they'd lost their limbs. He was going, "That doesn't mean you're any less. And let me show you." And so if anyone has a chance to see The Best of Men, that is a phenomenal story about a male role model. and an honoring of the essence of a man on so many levels. Anyway, the importance of a real model, especially for sons who've lost fathers, other men coming in to support that. I'll let you speak to the importance.
I think it's great to honor men who have done wonderful things. I mean, that's a good thing. I don't want to take away from it, but that's also part of the hierarchy. Who's done the best thing? Who's done the next best thing? And really, role models for males these days, I think, is shifting, because a lot of the role model stuff has been based on men in the hierarchy and men basing their value on what they do. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift into men valuing themselves for who they are as being human beings, not human doings. And that's hard for men, because we've been taught over and over again that our value in the hierarchy is based on how much we do, how much we get accomplished, how much we make, how much, how many women, blah, 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 right? But men are rarely taught to value that they have great value just in their being, just in their beingness. And that I see as the new push for role modeling, is find a man who values himself for who he is. That's a good role model for other young guys,
Well, and maybe another way to put it then would be in honoring your reflection around that and the shift of what a true role model is. But in grief, perhaps the better way to say it is another male who's safe and will respect you in all the dimensions of the experience, in your vulnerability and your strength. And that's true for men and women.
Yes, I was going to say that. That's right. That's true for everybody.
I think of young boys who've lost the father, and the uncle says, "Oh yeah, we're going to take you fishing and we'll be there for you."
Exactly.
And then
Precisely.
but then you never see him again. If you see him, that's great.
But he doesn't take them fishing?
Well, no, I'm saying if the guy sticks with that and stays with him and is that presence, then that's a gift.
Yeah.
To be careful not to glibly offer that to a young man or a boy
not follow
who's
through.
Grieving and not follow through.
Yeah, that's
because
not good.
That presence is so to actually, mentor a young man or a boy who's lost a father in that active mode, it would be a gift too.
Yes. And men know how to do that naturally. They'll take the boy places. They'll do things with the boy. They move into this masculine mode of shoulder to shoulder. They don't pull two chairs up and face each other and say, "Let's talk about our feelings." I don't know any man that would ever pull that kind of crap.
Right.
Men know naturally what to do, and they do it. They do it. It's just people haven't labeled it as being healing.
Okay, so I'm just looking at our
The
time together. So yes.
And there's a couple of things we haven't talked about that I'd like to just mention real briefly.
Well, and I was going to ask you, like,
I beat you to it.
Men and women, what are the key things that you want them to know in general?
Well, I think what we've talked about so far is good. That is that we're different. Everybody's different. And some men are going to want to talk about their emotions. I mean, there's going to be probably 25% of men who will be more comfortable in a support group kind of environment. Just like there'll be probably 25% of women who'll be much more comfortable taking some sort of action, And the important thing I want to make sure to leave people with is there's research out there that shows this to be the truth. Shelley Taylor was one piece, but there's more than that. There's testosterone research. If you look up Eisenegger and testosterone, in fact, I can give you a link to that study that he did that shows how testosterone is striving for status. It's not about violence or aggression. It's about striving for status. And that, of course, feeds the whole dominance hierarchy piece, right? But there's two other pieces of research that we need to talk about before we stop, and that is precarious manhood and moral typecasting. And I won't belabor either one, but I would just encourage people to research those. Precarious manhood says boys and girls are different. Boys, when they hit puberty, and this is around the world, they've done studies around the whole world, it's the same every place. Boys have to prove they are men after they hit puberty. Girls do not have to prove they are women. And so it creates a very different world that boys and girls live in and that men and women live in. And this moves the man into this hierarchy thing because he's moved into this place where he has to prove publicly that he's a man. And it's easy to lose that also. That's Precarious Manhood. Vandello is the researcher that's done the most work on it. It is mind-blowing stuff. It's very important for men and women to read because it tells us how we live in very different worlds. In fact, I did a video on this that maybe I should give you the link to that too. But the other thing is moral typecasting, which basically says now that we know from research that men are going to get less compassion than women. I mean, that's huge. They're calling it the empathy gap, the empathy gap. And so this is why people, when they come up to men after a death, will say, how's your wife holding up? This is why. And so we understand now what's underneath this stuff in a different kind of way. And it also helps men understand why no one wants to know what's going on with them. So I would encourage, Precarious Manhood, moral typecasting. Tanya Reynolds has done the work, the recent work on moral typecasting, and Kurt Gray, I think, did the earlier work on it.
I'm going to tell one little story and then we'll wrap up with that.
Tell a story.
Fine. My husband, who's died, he lost a son to leukemia at 7.5 in the first marriage. And, a lot of that grief wasn't shared until he ended up, we were married and I was doing hospice work and I did some work with children in a children's hospice. And so I always knew it was a challenging death, and I watched the sibling. But when COVID unfolded in my office, I had gone through most of his papers, but then when I went to look and I was renovating stuff, I got into stuff like, wow, there's way more stuff here than I thought. And I got to this is one of those kind of unique moments you can't really fully explain. But he had, those little old Dick and Jane books that children have, readers.
Yeah.
And there was a little book. His son's name was Brad, and he had the little reader book. And I cleared out most of it because it was 12 years and kept things for me. But I got to this little book, and I picked up the book, and I thought, oh, here's little Brad's Dick and Jane or Read or whatever it is. And I thought, oh, I should just throw that out. And people say that things carry energy and you can feel it sometimes. And I picked up that book so many times. But when COVID was unfolding and I was in this quiet place and I picked it up and I thought, oh, I should just throw that out now. And when I said, I'm going to throw it out, I was relaxed enough. I was open, but there was an energy to that book. And I just got nailed. And I'm even now, I want to cry when I think about holding that book. Like it just hit my heart like somebody was stabbing me, and I couldn't breathe. I had to start walking around my place, and I could feel my husband's grief for that child to a depth I had no understanding of. I sat down and I wept for 20 minutes holding that book. And I said to him, inwardly, I said, honey, I am so sorry. I knew the death of this child was hard for you, but until I picked up this reader, something opened, and I thought, oh my God, how many other men have lost a child or have lost a loved one or are carrying that depth of grief that we don't see. And somehow there was a moment where that opened up and I just got it. And I could not breathe and wept for 20 minutes and just held his heart, even though he's gone, and the book, and thought, wow, like that was having an influence on your life in a way I will never know the depth of until this moment that I was shown that.
Wow.
So
Great story.
I mean, it was profound. And it gave me a different compassion for his son, who's a mature man now, right, too. So another reason this conversation is important, to open and explore and set our expectations aside as to how it will be expressed, and so the action, the ritual, shoulder to shoulder, all the things you've shared, I thank you so much for this. And of course, your books are available for people to purchase and read, and you offer consultations as well. Before we I reflect on the website too. I want to ask you, I always like to end on a personal note with my guest. I mean, as the warrior, hunter, gatherer, not gatherer, warrior, hunter, protector, provider, male that you are stepping into this, on the flip side of that, because in grief, it's about the heart and connection. As a man companioning other men through this, and just in your own loss, what have you learned through all of this about your own heart and love through the companioning of men? Like how have you been changed by witnessing the beauty and the challenge and the grief of men over the years?
Yeah, I think that working with grief has been a blessing.
Mm.
Anytime you hear someone else's grief, it resonates your own.
Mm.
There's no way around it. When you hear someone's story, it resonates a part of you that may have had something similar in some ways. So I've gained tons from having worked with grief, just tons, because it resonates in me. I mean, we're not rocks. We're open to what's going. If you're going to be open, it's going to resonate stuff within you. And Rumi said it best. Rumi said, "Grief is the garden of the heart." And so I'd answer your question by saying, yeah, and by being in grief for so many years, it's really opened my heart in a very different kind of way. And I'm so happy that I locked into St. Francis because I see other people in my grad school who went to other counseling centers who never had that kind of experience, who are all into the DSM and numbers and this is and that's, and the grief doesn't allow that. It's just, you've got to be yourself. You've got to be your real self and to resonate with what they're going through and let that be in you too for at least a bit, and that's a blessing, boy. That's a blessing. And it helps us understand how to stay in the present moment. And there's no more greater blessing than that. I mean, the more we can understand staying in the present moment, the more we're closer to the divine, right? So that's one more piece of this. So yeah, I've gotten lots from it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for coming
You're very
on
welcome.
today.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I know we're just opening this in dialogue to introduce people to a different awareness and journey, but your books, as we said, are available. And your website is webhealing.com.
Yes, webhealing.com is there.
And we will put a link on the YouTube page so that you can see all these added sources for information and understanding. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I learn so much every time I'm with you. You've taught me a lot. I'm really grateful. It's enriched my practice and my life and my relationships too. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate you saying that.
Okay.